So everyone, thank you for coming to today's True Talk. We have presenting today Astrid, who is a PhD student in the computational modeling group at the Department of Chemical Engineering. So we're going to have Astrid give us a talk for the next 25 minutes. And if you have any questions, you may want to put it down in the chat column or wait until the end of our talk to ask your questions. So Astrid, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. I will share my screen. So hopefully you can now see my screen.
Yeah, it's fine.
Great. First of all, thanks very much for letting me come and give this talk. I actually defended my PhD 2 weeks ago, so it's really nice to have one more opportunity to present my research at this stage. My PhD work was jointly funded by Reactor, which is a company that makes pigments in the UK, and the National Research Foundation of Singapore. So I actually spent 2 years of my PhD sitting in this building on the right-hand side in Singapore. But Reactor makes titanium dioxide pigments, and so I was studying detailed population balance modeling and the application of Monte Carlo methods. But I did this in the context of the titania process. So I thought I would start with some motivation. And I just wanted to highlight, this is the kind of particle that's produced in the titania process. This is a raw product particle. And it's obviously this sort of very complicated structure that is comprised of multiple aggregates that are multiple primary particles that are connected together with varying degrees of cohesion. And this is really important because it has implications for the size and for the properties of the product particles that are used to make the pigments. In the industrial reactor, there's a very complicated set of processes that happen to form these particles from precursor gas phase molecules. And the industrial reactor consists of multiple injection points as well as a very hot oxygen feed. And this results in very high conversions, which results in very high mass fraction of solid particles. So there's this intense coupling between the flow, the reaction chemistry, the energy balance, and the particles. And this makes it a challenging system to study. So the objective of my thesis work has been to develop a framework for detailed population balance modeling and use it to study the industrial titania process. And this has been work that we've had this partnership with Reactor in my PhD group for a number of years now. And we sort of incrementally made developments to try and aid us in modeling this coupled gas phase and particle phase system. So I'm going to just talk about that a little bit. First of all, the gas phase is described by a mechanism that has about 29 different gas phase molecules in it. And these go from the precursor, which is titanium tetrachloride, as well as oxygen, through various intermediate species that are titanium oxychlorides. And the way that the precursor is broken down and then oxidized is described by a set of 66 reactions that all occur in the gas phase. And this gives us a set of about 30 ordinary differential equations that is well suited to solving with an implicit ODE solver. And in particular, we use the backwards difference solver from the CVODS package for anyone who's into numerics. On the particle side of things, we really want to be able to describe this complex particle structure that develops in the reactor. So we use a detailed particle model, and this is sort of shown schematically on the left-hand side of my slide. So we track the primary particles, which are the small particles that are formed when gas phase molecules collide. And then we also track how these particles stick together and overlap into each other over time in the reactor. So the particle kinetics include inception from the gas phase, which I've mentioned already, as well as various growth mechanisms, including coagulation, where particles collide and stick together in point contact, and sintering, where over time they reduce their surface area for energetic reasons. And this results in a degree of overlap, forming a neck between the two particles. And then there's also growth by surface growth, which is direct deposition of mass from the gas phase onto the surface of the particle. And with these very detailed particle models, we can really only look at the evolution of this equation shown here using Monte Carlo methods, because deterministic methods suffer the curse of dimensionality, which is basically they scale very poorly with large numbers of dimensions in the particle type space. So I'm going to just draw out some features of this equation that I want to solve. First of all, we talk about the number density of particles. So that's n of x, where x is the particle type. So I've drawn the kind of particle type that we're looking at over here. And then this is basically formed by particle inception, coagulation, which is the process by which particles collide. So when two particles stick together, they can form a new particle that's larger, but also when particles of size x collide with other particles, then they're lost from this size class. Then there's also surface growth and flow. So in order to solve this system, we use a stochastic algorithm, which essentially takes the total rate of all the particle processes and uses it to predict how frequently events will happen. So that's the waiting time, as well as which events will happen. So we inform the probability that an event will occur by the relative ratio of that process rate to all of the rates in the system. And then we perform that event. So for example, if the event is inception, and we have this particle ensemble that's shown here as a collection of square boxes, some of which are filled with particles, then inception results in adding a new particle to our system. If the event is surface growth, then we pick a particle at random and add extra mass to its surface. For coagulation, two particles collide, and this makes a new particle that is the combined sum of those two particles. Inflow obviously results in adding new particles into our system, and this can require some scaling if the number of particles that we have in the inflow stream is different to the number of particles in the system. And then finally, outflow, which is a process by which particles are removed from our system. So once we've done that process, we increment the time by this waiting time that we sampled, and we continue to do this for a given step size. And then the one final thing that can happen is the particle process rates can have very different orders of magnitude. And in that case, it can also be a good idea to perform some of the events deterministically at the end of every time step. So for example, this is the case with sintering. Because all of the particles sinter independently, we can do this event over the time interval t plus t step to t at the end of every step. So to go back to the system of gas phase and particle phase kinetics, in order to achieve the coupling, we use operator splitting, which allows us to separate the gas phase and the particle phase updates into separate steps. And in particular, we use Strang operator splitting, which was proposed by Gilbert Strang and is shown to be second order accurate. And basically how it works is it staggers the time steps. So we do half a step of the gas phase, and then the whole step of the particle phase, and then the gas phase, and then the particle phase, and so on. So that's sort of the model that we have. And of course, it's very important to validate this against experimental data. And it's not possible to do this in an industrial context because the data is simply not available. However, we have in our group developed fairly extensive testing facilities in the laboratory. So we have these laminar stagnation flame experiments, and we can directly compare the 3D particle morphology that comes out of our simulations to the data that we get from the experiments. And what is shown on my slide here is that this has been done for a number of different flame cases, and we found really good agreement between both aggregate size distributions and primary particle size distributions. So we are confident that at least we have this means in place by which we can test different mechanistic developments in our model. It's also nice because it allows us to watch the particles forming in real time. So I have here some videos which you may be able to see, hopefully they're playing, where particles form under different conditions. So what you can see is on the left-hand side, which is relatively cool, the particles are coagulating, but they don't sinter significantly. So they form these long fractal-like structures. Whereas at the higher temperature shown on the right-hand side, there's a significant amount of sintering and surface growth. So we get much larger primary particles, and the structure that we form is much more compact. So that has implications in the industrial process because the size and shape of the pigment particles is very important. So the thing on the left, it would be very easy to break apart in a milling operation as a post-process. But the thing on the right may be very difficult to impossible to pull apart. So in early work during my PhD, I looked at building a reactor model, or model for this reactor that was able to account for important features in the reactor, which include multiple injection points for the precursors, but also was sufficiently simple to allow us to describe the gas phase and particle phase in a lot of detail. So this is essentially a tanks in series model that accounts for injections at multiple stages. And you can see that we can use our detailed particle model to pull out features of aggregate particle structure as well as primary particle structure along the length of the reactor. However, what this work also highlighted is that this is a very computationally expensive model, so it runs for orders of days. And also it has a number of numerical issues in terms of robustness or responsiveness to choice of numerical parameters. The problem that I needed to address next was this problem of contractions, which is essentially described on the slide here. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit using this cartoon. In the algorithm that we use, we predefine a particle ensemble. So this is space and memory to store new particles as they are incepted or as they flow into our domain. And then over time, the number of particles in our computational ensemble increases. And at some point, we will hit the predefined limit on our space in our ensemble. And at this point, what's typically done in these kinds of simulations is that we choose a particle at random and remove it from the system. But then we rescale the sample volume so we still have the correct number density. And that's kind of a numerical trick that shouldn't be performed too often because it essentially results in randomizing the results that we've spent time and effort resolving. So there are some alternatives. We can also run with a smaller sample volume, which means a smaller inception rate, but this is less statistically significant, so it's not desirable. And the alternative is that we can use a larger particle ensemble, but this is more computationally expensive. So in the second part of my PhD, I was looking at introducing a different option. And essentially what we decided to do was introduce this sort of hybrid particle number model, where we track the number of small insignificant particles just simply using a particle number counter that counts the number of particles at each given size. And then we track the number of large complicated aggregate particles using a detailed particle model that can describe their morphology. And the nice thing about this is because our primary particles are relatively simple in both cases, this is exactly the same algorithmically as what we were doing before. It's just significantly more efficient. And this is sort of sketched on the left-hand side of my slide here, where if we go back to this original case where we were running out of space in the predefined ensemble, we now have this third option, which is to use the hybrid particle model. And this allows us to avoid this problem because we can track practically arbitrarily many particles in a much more simple way. And then we can just use the detailed particle definition where we need it. And this results in lower error for a given cost. So that's why it improves the efficiency of these simulations. And you can see that on the right-hand side here, where the red bars are much lower than the other two. So this was really fortuitous for modeling the industrial titanium reactor because it allowed a sort of best of both worlds simulation scheme. Because in the industrial titanium reactor, in the early stages where there's injection of a lot of precursor through the walls of the reactor, there are lots of small primary particles formed by inception. So the particle number model is really great for tracking this high number of small particles that are formed. But downstream, where there's lots of collisions and the particles start to sinter together, we can use the detailed particle model to resolve this complicated particle structure that forms. And this is sort of demonstrated on the top left of the slide here, where we look at what happens in a series of reactors. Here, the gray line shows the ensemble capacity, the traditional limit on how many particles we can store. And you can see this red line, which is tracking the simple small particles, frequently exceeds that gray line. So it allows us to dynamically decide how many particles we want to have in our simulations, which makes the simulation more robust. And downstream, if we look at PFR number 1 over here, we can still hand over to this detailed particle model where we need it most, where particles start to be more complicated. So we can use this added simulation efficiency to explore a wider range of interesting process conditions. And in particular, one of the things I looked at was what happens if you vary the spatial frequency of the precursor injections. And that's shown on the right-hand side here. So as we move in from blue dots to orange dots to red dots, that's increasing the spatial frequency of injections. And what you can see is with more injections, we get a much narrower particle size distribution and a much lower maximum geometric standard deviation in the primary diameters. So that's really great from a perspective of the industrial process, where what you really want is a consistent product and also a small, well, sort of reasonably small particle size. And this is also in line with what is observed in the industrial process, where they do operate with these multiple feed points. So that's also nice to see. And then the final thing that I wanted to draw attention to is, because we have this particle model that tracks the 3D morphology of particles, we can directly compare with imaging from the industrial product. So that's shown on the right-hand side here. And what you can see is that our particle model produces primary particles that are on average larger than the industrial product. And it's, I guess, worth noting here that we are not fitting to any experimental parameters. So we don't expect an exact match. Obviously, the reactor model is also quite simple. But we also get qualitatively quite a similar sort of complicated aggregate structure that's quite compact. So it's not one of those long fractal aggregates that I showed before. Finally, this also allows us to predict the fractal dimension, which is a measure of the particle structure again, without making any assumption on the particle geometry. And this is really important because it informs a lot of the processes that happen in the reactor. So it's nice to be able to do this without making further assumptions, which was historically the case. So to end the first part of my talk, I have some highlights from my PhD work. Firstly, I proposed this modular description of the reactor that allowed for a detailed description of both the particle dynamics and the gas phase. That had some limitations, which I addressed in a second component, where I developed this hybrid particle model that provided more robust and efficient simulation. And then finally, this allowed us to present a comprehensive study where we looked at what happens when we change different conditions in the process, and we could really start to answer questions that are of interest to industrial practitioners about this process. And this is really possible through the combination of a very detailed particle model and an efficient simulation algorithm, the Monte Carlo algorithm, that allows us to track this complicated particle type space in a way that is not intractably computationally expensive. So it seems topical in the context of Monte Carlo algorithms to talk about my next random jump event. And I am now a postdoc at the Department of Physics at Chalmers University in Sweden. This photo was taken on a very nice day, so it's frequently not that sunny here, but it's still a really nice place to be. And here I've been studying the structure-activity relationship for copper nanoparticles in nanofabricated reactors. So I thought I would just end this talk by talking about this a little bit, because you can draw some parallels with the work I was doing previously. So I'm studying these systems that are shown on the top here. It's a sort of nanoreactor on a chip. Someone told me earlier today this looks like a star destroyer. I think that's the right term, but I'm not super familiar with movies, so I'm not sure. But here you see in this corner over here, the reactor components of the chip design. And this is an array of nanoparticles that can be structured in different ways according to the desires of the experimentalist. Essentially, the important components here are an injection point on this side at high pressure. The reactor goes over here, and then there's an outlet that goes to a QMS, which is a quadrupole mass spectrometer. So that measures the concentrations, but that's at very low pressure. So there's quite a significant pressure drop across the system. They've experimented with two different reactor types, and here we have these little green patches are 10 by 10 arrays of copper nanoparticles. So there's one system that has 5 in a row with 5 underneath, and another system that's a channel that has 10. And there's also this optical microscope over here allows direct imaging of these nanoparticles. So in addition to TEM images, which are images G and H shown on the slide, we also get this image F, which is an online measurement of the activity of the particles. So this is really nice. And in this paper, we proposed a microkinetic model that could be coupled to a system model in order to describe what's happening in this problem. But if you look at these complicated structures that form because of oxidation of the copper nanoparticles, it's really interesting to be able to study also what happens in detail on the surface. So this is the mechanism that I proposed originally. This has got adsorption and desorption on the catalyst surface, as well as reactions, oxide formation, and then destruction of the oxide. But what we want to do now is put the surface under the microscope, as it were, have a closer look, and in particular resolve site types, surface diffusion, and interactions between adsorbates, which are not possible to model in the context of the microkinetic model that we had before, which assumes that the surface is homogeneous. So that brings us to the next equation that I'm looking at, which is the chemical master equation, which talks about the probability that a chemical system will change state over time. And this is informed by transition probabilities or rate constants, depending on what field you come from. And these are basically described by first principles simulation data or experimental data. So they inform how quickly the system will change state over time and what state it will go into. So once again, Monte Carlo is the tool of choice for solving this kind of problem. And essentially, the kinetic Monte Carlo simulations work in a similar way to the way that I described for my other system. So they consist of sampling waiting times based on the rates of the different processes, and then choosing which process will happen according to the relative rates of the different processes. And we simulate in this way until we've reached some final state. And this provides a computationally effective way to describe complex systems. So essentially, at length scales that are out of reach to first principles dynamic simulations. We still want to look at what happens on the surface per site. We can do this with Monte Carlo. And in particular, this is really useful for nanoparticles because it's been shown that for nanoparticles, the different sites have very different activities. So for example, shown here for ethylene selectivity, we can see that corner sites have much higher ethylene selectivity than, for example, this 111 red face. So that can be really important for looking at how kinetics evolve on the surface over time. So I've done some preliminary work looking at oxide formation on my copper nanoparticles. So I'll just play these two videos. This is with different rates of oxide formation. So on the left-hand side, what you can see is oxygen adsorbing onto the surface and then converting into a copper oxide structure. So the black lines, the black squares are where copper oxides have formed. But on the right-hand side, the oxide formation is relatively slow. And in this case, the oxygen actually recombines and desorbs from the surface without any significant formation of oxide. And these kind of simulations are quite important because the formation of different copper oxides on the surface are quite poorly understood. These are not processes that we have experimental rates or first principles rates for. So it's kind of interesting to see what happens under different conditions. And there's a lot more development in this model that I hope to do in the future. So in closing, I'd just like to acknowledge my funding sources, both during my PhD and during my current postdoc, as well as, of course, my supervisor, Professor Marcus Kraft, and my other advisor, Jethro Aykroyd, who are also both Churchillians, as well as the Como group and my postdoc supervisors. And also, thank you very much for tuning into this talk. As I say, it gave me another opportunity to present my research, so thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Astrid. That was a very interesting presentation. We will now take questions. If anyone has a question, please feel free to ask. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, this is Georgia. Hi, Astrid.
Hi, Georgia.
Thanks for the talk. So as a disclaimer, I've been looking at titanium dioxide and TEM for a while, including stuff that was done possibly under Marcus like 10 years ago. I was wondering, so in all your models, the particles are spheroids. Very often, TiO2 grows in a faceted way. Mm. And I was wondering whether it's something that comes into your model or it doesn't, because I imagine that affects the sintering and how different facets grow.
Yeah, so in our in the model that I used in this work, the primary particles, so those are the small particles, are assumed to be spherical. So they basically have some radius that's determined by their mass. And then as they collide together, our model accounts for how that mass changes or how the radius changes as they sinter into each other. So we have like an overlapping spheres model. So we can sort of pass mass between them. But what we don't do currently in the model is track crystal phase. So everything is sort of, as you say, there's no facet formation. It's actually something that we're building in now, also based on experimental work that we're doing. So hopefully this will be something that we sort of can model development along different crystal grains in the future as well.
Okay, also, thank you. Another question, if I may. So what is the best size for these particles? So,
it's sort of in the range of 220 to 240 nanometers for the pigmentary process.
Is that for maximum reflectivity essentially?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah, coming from a biological science background, I was just wondering how do you ensure that your mechanism, when you're taking in and removing your particle, how do you ensure that the particle of interest is not removed at one step?
With the tracking of the videos.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, it's sort of interesting. These are not my videos, and so I can only conjecture. I think that this is done in a batch reactor simulation, so that the particles never move. They're always in the system from the moment they form. So we essentially just track or put a tracker on one of the particles and then follow how it coagulates over time. But it has nowhere to go out of the simulation. So it's sort of a fixed volume.
Okay, okay, thanks. Yeah, any more questions? Okay, if there's no more question, we're going to say a very big thank you to Astrid for this wonderful presentation. And like I said, I'll just stop the recording. We will be recording it and I'll send you the copy when it's been uploaded to the cloud. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who was able to join us today. Looking forward to seeing you next week again. Thank you. Thanks. If you want to give her a round of applause, you can unmute and give her a round of applause, please.